I am Theodora Scarrato of Environmental Health Trust, and we're a scientific nonprofit working on the issue of wireless radiation, health, and environment. 5G and 4G small cells are proliferating nationwide. They're going up in front of homes and schools. And while we assume, as I did, that the federal government is ensuring safety for people and for the environment, in fact, this is a myth because what we have are limits that are completely outdated. When it comes to wildlife, the government has entirely dropped the ball. Current regulations are human centric and they don't consider birds, bees, or trees. Cell tower and base station antennas from those big cell towers, as well as small cells, even though they're not so small, they are emitting wireless radiation, which is also called radiofrequency, increasing the levels that are in our environment. There was a 2018 study done which found levels in Los Angeles, California, now 70 times higher than the levels measured in the city as part of a study that was done with the EPA and FCC several years ago in the 70s. So, this is an image from a study done in South Carolina looking at small cells, where they examined the levels on the street from what was called a small cell facility. And the colors are there to show how the intensity changes if you're in the most intense part of the beam and where it hits on the ground. And you can see there are darker and lighter colors of red. You can't see it, it's invisible, but it's very much there. And there are trees and animals that are in the intense beam of these antennas. There is an extensive body of research on the issue of impacts to pollinators. There is a study that was just published last year. It was a systematic review and meta analysis on insects and electromagnetic fields. That includes radio frequency, which is wireless, and was published in Reviews on Environmental Health. And it found the vast majority of studies found effects, and they say generally harmful ones. And studies have found impacts to reproduction, development, metabolism, behavior, orientation, memory, oxidative stress, and genetic impacts as well. Everything that I'm going to talk about, you can find the peer-reviewed, published science on this website, wildlifeandwireless.org. When you hear that a small cell is going up in your neighborhood, it can include frequencies we've had for many years and also these higher frequencies, which are really new to these commercial networks. They're also being explored for 6G and 7G, and it's going higher and higher up. With these higher frequencies, that can change the way that energy is absorbed into animals. So these images are from a study published in Scientific Reports. It is in a European Union funded study on insects and how they absorb the wireless radiation at different frequencies. And they were looking at 5G and a lot of the technology that's going to be used in future networks, and found that as the frequency got higher, the body of the insects absorbed more power, and that can lead to heating in the insects. And they specifically state that this could lead to changes in insect behavior, physiology, and morphology over time. The scientists who published this have actually published several other studies looking at the intensity into different organs of the bee. And they also have published studies saying that there needs to be measures that happen right now to protect wildlife because they are most exposed. And they can, of course, be overheated if they were very close to the antennas, which is a concern that is not addressed in our current regulatory schemes. This study was published in Scientific Reports. It actually looked at other insects as well, and you can find it on wirelessandwildlife.org. Now, the question that people often ask is, well, what are the regulations that we have in the United States, and how much radiation do we allow into the air? The United States is one of the countries that has the most lenient limits. We allow the most radiation, along with several other countries. So, United States FCC limits for wireless RF fail to protect children and wildlife. These limits, which were developed in 1996, were not designed to address biological effects, the effects of long-term exposure. We didn't have the kind of data we had decades ago in 1996. nor were they designed to address today's exposures from numerous sources and numerous layers of antennas, for example, outside. We have 4G, 5G. We actually have a lot of new networks that are being put in, Wi Fi as well. Or children's unique vulnerability. Research has shown that they absorb proportionally more radiation compared to adults. And of course, they weren't developed for wildlife and plants. They are called human exposure limits specifically. So in 2019, we launched a lawsuit against the FCC for its decision not to update these limits. In August of 2021, the United States Court of Appeals, DC Circuit, ruled in our case, Environmental Health Trust et al. Versus the FCC, that the FCC's decision not to update these antiquated 1996 wireless radiation limits was arbitrary and capricious because numerous issues had been ignored. There were thousands of pages of science, policy, and expert recommendations on the FCC record, which were found to have been ignored. The FCC did not even talk about them. And just to give you an example of some of the science that was on the FCC record, which they ignored, this was done, this is a European Union funded research that looked at the absorption into, in this particular image, a woman, a child, and an adult. And this is from a far field exposure, a cell tower, a 4G, 5G, or something that is not in your hand, for example, is considered a far field. This is a simulation that's done. Engineers use supercomputers to develop these images, and the colors represent the intensity of the rate of absorption. And the yellow is the highest level, and it goes from yellow to orange to red to purple to blue. You can see that the child is mostly yellow, whereas the adults have a lot of blue on them. Research has shown with many different kinds of technologies proportionately higher exposure to the child. In August 2021, the U.S. Court of Appeals DC Circuit ruled in our lawsuit, Environmental Health Trust et al. Versus the FCC, that the FCC's decision not to update their antiquated, outdated 1996 wireless radiation limits was arbitrary and capricious because numerous issues had been ignored. On the FCC record were thousands of pages of evidence submitted by Environmental Health Trust, as well as several other groups, organizations, and experts around the world, stating that FCC's limits were not protective and the FCC had ignored them. The court remanded the case to the FCC, ordering them to provide a reasoned explanation for their determination that the guidelines were adequately protective. And they specifically needed to address impacts to children, long-term exposure, the ubiquity of wireless devices and technological developments since 1996, and impacts on the environment because there was substantial science on impacts to plants and insects, pollinators and trees and so forth that was on their record they had ignored. As of today, the FCC has not responded to the court. They cannot show or have not shown how these limits, how the regulations are adequately protected. The Court of Appeals specifically said the FCC had completely failed to even acknowledge, let alone respond to comments concerning the impact of RF radiation on the environment. Now, since the court case, there have been numerous published studies on the impacts to wildlife. I'm going to talk to you just about a few of them and also some of the science that the FCC had on its record. There was a landmark review by U.S. experts of over 1,200 studies on impacts to flora and fauna, stating that biological effects have been seen broadly across all taxa and frequencies studied at vanishingly low intensities comparable to today's ambient exposures, those exposures that we experience outside. Companies will often say that, oh, it's so low, the level that you're experiencing from this small cell or 5G small cell is just so low. It's nothing compared to the limit. It's, 1% and so forth. However, animals and insects, especially smaller animals, are uniquely vulnerable. Now, this three-part review of thousands of studies, they concluded that broad wildlife effects have been seen on orientation and migration, food finding, reproduction, mating, nest and den building, territorial maintenance and defense, and longevity and survivorship. Cytotoxic and genotoxic effects have been observed. And what of the impact to trees? Here you have an image from a study called Radiofrequency Radiation Injures Trees Around Mobile Phone Base Stations, published in Science of the Total Environment. And this is an image showing the tree and the antennas and how over time there's damage to the side of the tree most exposed to the radiofrequency radiation from the antennas. What they did in this study is look at trees over several years and followed them, taking pictures and also measuring the radiofrequency radiation on the sides of the tree. So they documented that there was a higher level on the side of the tree facing the antennas. This study looked at over 100 trees and found over time damage to the tree canopy. And in many cases, they ended up having to fell the tree because of the damage to the leaves and to the limbs. Here's another image from the study, Radiofrequency Radiation Injures Trees, and they concluded that statistical analysis demonstrated that electromagnetic radiation from mobile phone masts is harmful for trees. If you see here on the right a small cell in front of an apartment, this small cell was put up less than 10 feet from this person's home. And the radiation extends out from the small cell into this home, which is right in line of sight of this antenna. This is happening all over the country, and yet there is no federal agency addressing the safety of this environmental exposure. The FDA does not address environmental emitters. They have made this clear in many documents. They specifically have stated that they do not regulate cell towers or cell tower radiation, and they have no studies or information to provide in response to questions. This quote that I have from the director of the FDA Office of Policy Center for Devices and Radiological Health is actually from a mother who had a small cell facility in California. It was her house with an antenna right in front of her home. And she had contacted the FDA about the safety because she was told that the FDA was ensuring safety. And she got this response back. There is no agency that is reviewing this issue. Now, many years ago, the EPA was the Environmental Protection Agency. In fact, what you're seeing here is images from a presentation they did on the development of exposure guidelines way back in the mid 90s. They were defunded just as they were poised to issue regulations on wireless radiation. And in fact, their last review that they have done was from 1984. And when I wrote them, I've written many letters to them and they've written back, they have clarified that they do not have a funded mandate for radio frequency matters. And when I asked about birds, bees, and trees, they said they are not aware of any EPA reviews that have been conducted on the issue. And they do not have any funded activities reviewing the issue of health or environmental effects. That's been made clear. And yet here we are, where the majority of studies on wireless radio frequency have found impacts. This is showing the results from an analysis by Professor Henry Lai. For the last few years, he has been looking at the research and looking at, what percentage of studies have found effects and what percentage of studies have not found effects. And when he looked at neurological impacts, he found 77% found effects, genetic impacts, 70% found effects, and oxidative stress, 89% found effects. Dr. Joel Moskowitz at the University of California, Berkeley has presented Dr. Henry Lai's research, and you can go to his website at saferemr.org to learn more about this as well. Many countries have policies aimed at mitigating the health risk to children by limiting the cell towers and cell antennas near kindergartens, hospitals, and schools. So you have Lithuania, Greece, Bangladesh, Israel, Chile, Queensland, Australia, India, and actually other countries like Italy and Switzerland have actual rules related to what is allowed in terms of the amount in the air. So their regulations look at this issue of where children live, work, and play. But not in the United States. We don't have any of these protections in place. In the United States, we don't have an oversight, compliance, and enforcement program like many other countries where they have registries of all sites or nationwide monitoring of what the levels are in various areas. We don't have that in the United States. In fact, what we have is tantamount to the honor system, where the companies get to present or say that they are compliant, and there's no one checking that they are. And there's no oversight in terms of the reports themselves for cell towers or wireless facilities, including small cells. So we have all of these facilities going up, but who's checking for compliance even with our outdated rules? And in fact, many countries, like this, for example, is from Switzerland, where they're doing monitoring and mapping and where they have checks in terms of what the companies say to ensure that there is an independent confirmation of that. And many countries, which include France, Greece, Turkey, Switzerland, and so on, I have a whole list here, they have robust oversight and compliance programs, but not the United States. Greece, for example, also has fixed stations where each little triangle you see here is for a monitoring station where they're measuring the levels 24/7, posting it transparently online. So you can go to a website, you can find the location near you, and you can see what the latest measurements are. But the EPA's last measurement on this was from 1986, their last report on measurements in the United States. Here's a map in Switzerland where they actually have the antennas, and you can zoom in and zoom out. I've zoomed out here to show it to you. But in the United States, we don't have this. There's no place where people can go and find where all the nearest sources are. In fact, if something goes up outside of your home, you basically have to be the FBI to find out what is it emitting, what's the level, who put it there, and so forth. There's no transparent oversight and enforcement system and no auditing done. And this is something that really needs to change. Until adequate limits for wildlife are developed, measures to mitigate and reduce the levels in ecologically sensitive areas, conservation areas, wildlife protected areas, bird habitat, turtle breeding areas, bee colonies needs to be urgently implemented. And this is stated by numerous experts who have published in the peer-reviewed literature. So what we are asking for and what it is so important that the public speak to their elected officials about is a transparent regulatory framework for wireless that mitigates risks and protects the public. The development of science-based limits for humans and non-humans. Full environmental reviews prior to the licensing and national build-out of these technologies like 5G, 6G, and beyond, and all of these small cells going up in front of people's homes. A research program with pre-market and post-market safety testing. This is critical, right? We assume, or I certainly assume, that there was pre-market and post-market safety testing. Nope, not at this time. A robust, publicly accessible oversight and compliance program with regular auditing to ensure that what the companies are saying is verified by independent professional. Nationwide monitoring and mapping of electromagnetic fields, radio frequency, wireless, including in forests, parks, and ecologically sensitive areas. A federal registry for all wireless facilities, 4G, 5G, small cells. We don't have that right now, and it's absolutely important that we have that. Every community should have a website where you can go online and you can find what is going up in front of your home, what are the frequencies, and what are the levels, and what are the proposed levels too. We need all those proposals to be up. Worker protections and interagency collaboration, of course, because many agencies at the federal level, as well as state and local communities, they all need to be working together and addressing this issue in a collaborative way. And of course, the implementation of measures to reduce exposure and manage risk. And you can go to wildlifeandwireless.org to learn more. If you see here, I have put pictures of posters and we have fact sheets and briefings that you can download to learn more about this issue. Ensuring a healthy future for children, wildlife, and the environment should be at the center of our decision-making process. Thank you so much, and go to Environmental Health Trust, Healthy Tech Home if you want to learn how to reduce exposure in your home, and wildlifeandwireless.org. And I just like to end with what's going on internationally. So, a few months ago in India, the Environment Ministry issued strict cell tower guidelines to protect tigers. Now, this happened because a few years prior, several agencies had looked at all of the science on wireless radiation and found the majority showed impact: birds, bees, trees, and humans. And they issued a set of recommendations that the various agencies have been addressing. And here we have the environment industry saying no installation of wireless antennas in core critical tiger habitat, no new towers within 1 kilometer of existing towers to avoid overlapping radiation. And they also recommended the mapping and public disclosure of cell antenna base station locations, and that there'd be the monitoring of the impacts on wildlife, particularly birds and bees, that there be surveillance, environmental surveillance, which is, of course, really important. And this all came from this country, which really took the time to look at the science, the up to date science at the time. Now, here we are in the United States where there has not been a hard look at all of the up to date science, and that is critical. Our hands are not tied on this issue. There is so much that can be done at the local, the state, and the federal level. Even with these antiquated federal laws that are non protective, local communities can take the time to develop a protective ordinance that protects them and also protects wildlife in ecologically sensitive areas. But each of us has a role to play to get there. Take a moment to contact your local elected officials and talk to them about this issue and ask that they do everything possible to protect their community and the environment. They need to hear from you. We need to be communicating to decision makers and elected officials what our concerns are about this issue and the real need for accountability at every level of government. Thank you so much for your time on this critically important issue.